And we are live on the pipeline. Thank you all for tuning in today. Welcome to the first episode. This is a Web3 podcast covering all things Monad. I'm really excited that you're all with us today. I'm Danny, your host. I've been around Web3 for a few years now, and in particular, I'm really excited to get going on this podcast, bringing on guests who are far more knowledgeable than myself to talk about all things Web3 with a particular focus on Monad. I'm thrilled as well to introduce today's guest. I have Mert from Helius Labs, who is known for being perhaps the most vocal and knowledgeable Solana advocate across crypto Twitter, but he's much more than that. Mert is also the founder of Helius Labs, a platform that aims to bring the ultimate developer experience to Solana. He is the co-host of the Lightspeed Podcast. I am honored to be joined today by Mert. How are you doing?
Thanks, man. Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. I'm excited to be on here with you. Like I was just saying, I really approach this from a research end. So to have someone as knowledgeable and outspoken as yourself, particularly during an exciting time like this, is always thrilling. I think it's key to mention that you are an engineer. You're working on blockchain-related problems all day long here. And I'm sure most people tuning in are familiar already, but would you mind giving a quick rundown of your crypto experience?
Sure, yeah. So crypto experience, well, I studied applied math and signals and communications engineering in school, and that required a good amount of cryptography, like pure cryptography courses, and that's when I first came across blockchains. At that time, I thought it was a bit more academic oriented than I would have liked. And so what I did was I worked in kind of all layers of finance. I worked at 3 or 4 big banks in Canada. I then worked my way up to slightly less integrated tech with like fintech companies, a few startups. And then after that, I went to Coinbase. And at Coinbase, I was one of the tech leads for platform engineering. So if you go on Coinbase.com and you see like your balances or your transaction histories for the different networks, that's some of the stuff I helped build. And kind of around then, I obviously got to learn about the different L1s and L2s and whatnot, and noticed a lot of kind of information asymmetry on the interwebs, and try to use some of the knowledge that I had to correct some of that, and been just doing that since. And obviously started Helius, which is a developer platform on Solana, to help developers build better, faster, and cheaper applications. And yeah, here I am.
Yeah, that's awesome. A really well-rounded experience, and I think that's certainly reflected in your Twitter presence. One thing that you just kind of brought up there, the misinformation and disinformation is definitely a huge problem in crypto today in terms of awareness, in terms of education. Do you think there's a solution on the horizon, and what would that look like?
So I think maybe to figure out a solution, it's useful to try to understand the root cause of the problem. And there's a few things here. One is that most of the misinformation, let's say, that I see is generally from folks who are not necessarily technical, and maybe have kind of a background that doesn't give them the greatest domain knowledge in what they're talking about, right? I mean, I have nothing against political science majors, but they probably don't understand complex blockchain engineering as much as the engineers working on them, right? And so you kind of have this environment where those types are the ones lecturing engineers about how to build systems. And generally speaking, in the case of crypto, most of those folks maybe got rich from early on, from being early to CoinX. And then now they have people looking up to them. They're like, wait a minute, if they got rich, maybe I can get rich. And so now you kind of have the blind leading the blind in a sense. And most people are kind of afraid or whatever to check that kind of stuff, because they're like, oh, well, it'll be too mean, or it'll burn some bridges and whatnot. But I think, like, while it's important to not be like directly insulting to people, it's, I think, pretty fair to like correct the misinformation so that people who are doing great work on a certain network aren't affected by complete lies and narratives. And so in terms of how you fix that, well, I think you need to have more builders speaking out. And this is something I've talked about a few times, but a lot of the builder types I would say are too smart for their own good in a sense, where they, maybe won't say something because they think like 0.5% of it is inaccurate and they'll be judged by other smart people. Or they're just like, whatever, like we'll build the best product and the other people will come to the product. And so like those are generally not going to work in a world where there's this much noise and attention is scarce and whatnot. And so I think one of the biggest parts of the solution is just more builders speaking out and writing and whatever that looks like. And I don't think and just like things like this, for example, like this podcast, but other podcasts and just people producing content, so that kind of there's like a meritocracy of ideas such that the best ones rise to the top, hopefully, and then there's like checks and balances with people saying like no that's false, or like yeah that's true, I agree, and there's just discourse. And so but what you can't have is like kind of what we've seen with the previous Bitcoin maximalism things, which is like taboo concepts where you're just not even allowed to speak, right? Like if you say something against whatever protocol X or public figure Y and people and you're like afraid to do it, and as a result the conversation isn't had, I think that's like a non-starter. And it's not perfect. I mean, I get in a lot of trouble for speaking up a fair amount of the time, but I think ultimately it's probably more worth it than not doing it.
Yeah, certainly. In general, a lot of people don't want to upset anyone through their dialogue. But as the technology scales, as you reach more users, as you cast that net wider, inevitably there's more noise around it. So I think you bring up a really great point there, and something I want to address based on your experience, in particular with Solana. What do you think it takes to grow an ecosystem to the point where we can say, okay, this has reached critical mass, aside from whatever direction the conversations may be going on Twitter?
So I don't think I have all the answers here, but there are certainly some things that help give you more confidence. And so I think in the case of Solana and maybe even and also Ethereum, one thing that you'll see in common with both of them is they kind of went through a phase where everybody was against them in a sense, and like a big kind of catastrophic event. But then they kind of came back stronger as a result. And so the only way you can actually do that is if there was something meaningful there to begin with. So that's like a pretty strong signal, I would say. And it's probably why you're seeing it reflected in the recent narrative today. But to get there, of course, you need to have something meaningful. And generally what that looks like in blockchains is going to be some combination of community, developers, and kind of combined values, I would say. So like a lot of people believe very strongly in kind of the user not having to pay basically anything and just focusing on product and innovating and tinkering and stuff. And whereas Ethereum is a much more academic oriented, and maybe they care a bit more about like node accessibility for like anywhere anyone can run a node. And so those kind of different values embedded in the kind of core propagate to different outcomes. But like the developer community is kind of a must, because at the end of the day, those are the people building the things. And so Solana does a lot of hackathons regarding this. I'm sure Monad will too. Hackathons are going to be super important. And then one other thing that like Monad does well in my view is like community building. Like you guys have, well, first of all, this podcast obviously, but also relatively strong advocates who are like certainly not toxic, but actually very funny, I would say, who create like some pretty solid memes, and I think that's pretty underrated. And I think Keone mentions this too in one of his tweets, which is like community is kind of the whole point of this thing, especially because like blockchains are essentially community computers at the end of the day. So, I think those things are really what makes you more confident, so that you can say, okay, well, we're getting to somewhere interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And when you have those core values that are espoused throughout the developer community and also the user community, then you really have an aligned group of consumers, customers, builders, what have you. So I certainly agree with you there. I want to jump over a little bit, slightly to the tech side of things and share one of your recent tweets.
Um, well, I fundamentally believe that when you're building systems, you need to optimize them from the bottom up. And maybe a good analogy might help for people who are not that technical that are listening. So when you're building a race car, let's say, you want to make sure that if you want to the fastest car possible, you start with the bottoms up approach, right? You design the best possible engine first, and then you make sure the chassis is correct, the aerodynamics are good, the tires are fine, and whatnot. What you can't do, or I mean, you can do this, but what I don't like is when the engine is like okay, and then you try to compensate to make the car faster by working on the other parts, right? Which I believe is kind of almost like what Ethereum is doing in a sense. I mean, they have to do it, right? The reason why Solana is fast is because it learned from the mistakes of Ethereum, not because we had some genius hindsight or something. It's just we saw what happened, and so what these chains, or I mean specifically Solana and Monad, have in common is like they're like, okay, wait a minute. The base L1 layer is kind of the engine, and you need to optimize that as much as possible, right? There's hardware here, and there's software, and how do you make the software take advantage of the hardware as efficiently as possible, right? And then if you do that, then the other parts are going to be easier to build, but also it's going to be less fragmented and less like duct tapey and subpar with how you choose to scale that. And so it's just about building a good starting foundation. And things like parallelization are kind of a no-brainer. It's a technical challenge on EVM because you don't have like the advanced access lists, but Monad has the parallel execution. It also has deferred execution. And I believe James, it was also even working on Solana stuff before. So there's a lot of overlap there in kind of how you guys think about this. And so I think it's awesome. I think it's a much better approach. And it allows builders to focus on product and not worry about the underlying scalability or any other weird things. And so they can just, build an application. Maybe they want to use Solidity and deploy in Monad. And I think that's a much better approach than doing it on the L2.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that race car analogy is really perfect. Coming at it from the ground up, Monad with that fully revamped EVM. What's your take in terms of Monad's value proposition of eliminating a lot of these Ethereum performance blockers or bottlenecks, and how successful do you see Monad being at kind of taking on those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few inefficiencies with the EVM, but at a high level, the easiest one most people will understand is the single thread execution model, which means if you have like transaction A, B, and C, and even if they're not overlapping in any way, it still has to go A, B, and then C. Whereas on a parallel machine, it can be like, okay, you have A, B, C, you parallelize them, and you do A, B, C at the same time, right? So that's kind of what Monad does, and that alone is a big improvement. But there's also state growth problems and state access, storage problems on the EVM. There's some inefficient code. And it seems like Monad is solving those as well. And also one thing that I do like a lot actually is kind of the deferred execution, which means that traditionally the way Ethereum works is you have to execute and then you do consensus, but Monad's like, no. Execution, the ordering of the transactions already determines the execution and how that's going to perform. So we can just do that not at the same time, and take advantage of that. It's actually a pretty obvious insight once you think of it. But so I think those undoubtedly help. In terms of how it will play out in production, I haven't I haven't looked at any of the numbers myself, but I'm pretty sure it'll be obviously much bigger improvement than anything else out there in terms of just EVM. And I think what's going to be the most important is not necessarily the kind of the performance improvements that they're doing. It's going to be cultivating developers to come build on that chain. I think the biggest challenge in tech generally is not building the tech itself, but it's like getting people to care such that they actually want to build on it, right? And a big part of that is in crypto, at least, it's dominated by noise and even politics to an extent. Like, oh, why aren't you using an L2? L2s are the future and stuff. And so I do find it interesting how Monad will approach that, because on the one sense they're EVM, and so they're very Ethereum kind of, not aligned, but Ethereum centric. But they also take a much different approach than Ethereum. So I think that's going to be a very interesting dynamic, which is part of why I like it. I think that's very promising.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're kind of touching on this already, but to zoom out perhaps a little bit, there's certainly been dialogue on Twitter that I've seen calling Monad the Solana of the EVM. And I think that's mostly due to performance promises in comparable areas. From what I've seen, the vibe from Monad has been hugely collaborative thus far, but I'm curious for your opinion. Do you envision a world where the EVM and the SVM can truly exist in mutualism?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in fact, I think that's inevitable in a sense. Maybe if you look at history or some historical examples, there's not really any case in history where there's kind of the one tech stack that's just everything. You have to your like iOS, there's an Android, to your Xbox, there's a PlayStation, or Nintendo. To your AWS, there's a Google Cloud or Azure or DigitalOcean. In terms of like free markets and software, there's always kind of multiple options that you're going to have because developers want to choose different things. And I think Solana, and specifically SVM and EVM, do optimize for different things in a meaningful way, right? Like Solana and Monad aren't like just an Ethereum fork, right? So not one of the common critiques that really gets me is all they've done is like increase hardware requirements, and that's absolutely not the case. The things that enables are actually much different. For example, order books, right? You cannot do that anywhere else. And then for Ethereum, you actually have to use L2s, and maybe those L2s use an SVM rollup, right? Or maybe an EVM rollup, whatever kind of works. But it's basically inevitable that both of them will coexist, and probably a third one will enter as well. Maybe something like a Move VM as well. And yeah, like I just don't see any way around that. Just if you just look at history and just markets in general, I mean, if somebody can point me to like a single example, I'll reconsider. But I mean, even like IBM, for example, was 95+% of the market. Didn't last too long. Same with Google Search. It just doesn't. Tech evolves so fast and competition so fierce, especially in such an interesting field like this. That competing, like, obviously there's room for collaboration, but it's always going to be free market competitive dynamic. Some modular people think something like maybe settlement happens on Ethereum, execution happens on Solana, and data availability happens on other layer. I know it's early for Monad, but it would be interesting to see where Monad comes into kind of the modular thesis as well. But yeah, I mean, long answer short, they will absolutely coexist, and probably even a third one will come in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's a refreshing and realistic perspective that, honestly, simple as it is in making that parallel to traditional tech, it's not brought up too often. And that brings me directly to what I wanted to talk about next, which was surfacing all over Twitter this past week, and that's the validator debates. So to share another one of your tweets from the past week, which was pretty well liked across crypto Twitter. What do you think about these validator debates overall, and how much should you be trading validator cost in order to achieve throughput? What's your perspective on the importance there?
Yeah, this is a pretty big topic, and there's many different dimensions to it, but I'll maybe talk about the two dimensions that I think might be most relevant. So one is that I think Ethereum, the way they've approached it, is make the nodes as accessible to run as humanly possible, so that anybody in whatever part of the world, in the event of World War III or whatever, can run the nodes. I think that's like a cool thing to optimize for. I think that I'm no one to say that's the wrong thing to optimize for. I think there's different there's different paths in the design space that we should exhaust, but I don't think it's the only way to do things, right? The problem with making something as accessible as possible to run a node for is it's the way the economy works is supply and demand, right? If you take care of the supply side, which is making it as easy as possible to run it, the demand side needs to be like, okay, well, I want to run this node. Okay, well, why would you want to run a node? Like, do you want to run a node just to run a node so you can post about it on Twitter? Some people do, but maybe that's not the best answer. You ideally want to run it because you actually have something of value on the network, and you want to make sure that people are behaving correctly, in accordance with the rules of the blockchain. Or maybe if you run a node, it's actually going to help your business, right? Maybe you're like a DeFi protocol and you want to collocate with your nodes, and you want to you have very strict requirements, and maybe the latency is reduced. So like, and so that's kind of the part that I feel like gets overlooked on this accessibility debate. Like, you can make something, for example, like I just ordered a Mac M3, like one of the newer laptops. It's not cheap. Now, the reason I did it, as opposed to like a much cheaper Windows, is because I think I'm going to get more value out of it. Right? It's great that Windows made it accessible for everybody, but I don't have the demand for it. It's the same thing with nodes. I don't care to run an Ethereum node because I don't care to do anything on Ethereum, because it doesn't support the types of applications I need, like an order book. Solana says kind of, or takes it a bit differently and says, okay, the node requirements are higher. Specifically, and a big misconception is that it's like the hardware requirements. The hardware requirements are like anybody who runs a gaming rig will be able to do it. It's really the internet that's actually the higher requirement. But in the case of Solana, the supply, so the accessibility is lower, but the demand for like the benefits that you get from running a validator are higher, because you can build many different things on the network that you can't build anywhere else, right? For example, if you're a product-minded person, you can now mint millions of NFTs for $100, and maybe you really care about kind of running your own nodes to provide additional security and whatnot, or maybe you have a stake, a validator that you want your users to delegate stake to. Okay, so now there's kind of the demand aspect. So it's kind of like a XY axis curve, and I don't think either way is right or wrong. They're just different things. So that's one. And then two is this validator profitability conversation. I think the way Ethereum approaches it is obviously quite different in that, they really care about the deflationary aspect of the token, and that's all good and fine. Like an Amazon or just a FANG company approach, where they say like, okay, this can be loss leading for now, right? And what matters first is kind of experimenting on top of the network, right? And building things on top of the network. We can figure out the tokenomics later. And if, for example, if the design space or the state that we've designed for the network is so valuable that you want to build your business on top of it, like let's say your USDC and Circle will have to run their own nodes on the blockchain, regardless of if it's loss leading or not, right? Because they need to do it for their business. So that's kind of the other approach. And again, neither are right or wrong in my view. This is just the approach that Solana takes, and it's great that these approaches are so different, because it's a good experiment to see what works and what doesn't, right? Like Ethereum did not have this robust token model until 1559, which wasn't in existence until after 6 years after released. And Solana's been around for barely like 3 years, probably not even 2.5, I would say. And so, and the other thing that gets me about these debates is like extremely inconsistent time horizons, right? Ethereum has been around for almost a decade now, and then Solana's been around for barely 3. But then people are like, well, Solana doesn't have this, and it's like, okay, well, ETH didn't have that either, right? These things take time. And anyway, so yeah, I mean, but to be clear, both the networks have the same end game, and Vitalik wrote about this. And the end game is such that block production, so the people who produce the blocks, they're going to use beefier, higher hardware requirement machines, and verification for like users is going to be done on lighter machines, and maybe use light clients or something for that. And Solana is working towards on its way there as well. And so it in some sense it's kind of wrong to even think about it as a trade-off, because both of them will do the same thing anyways. It's just about which path they take to get there, which is a very short-term thing, especially if your time horizons that are 5 to 10 years. And also, this is all with Solana having unoptimized validator clients. So Jump Crypto is working on a new client called FireDancer, and they're already showing that hardware requirements are coming down because of how much juice they're able to squeeze out of the existing software, right? And so, 100% of tech, I believe, I think 100% of tech scales with hardware, right? That's how like cars work, computers work, phones work. You need, like, if that stopped, we have much bigger problems than trading meme coins, right? And so as a result, I think maybe it's a bit overblown. So yeah.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And thanks for the well-rounded answer. To touch on scaling, as we were just kind of there at the end of that question, my impression is that you're probably not the biggest fan of L2s. Would you say that's correct? And would you mind expanding on that as well?
I like L2s from just a pure nerd perspective, and liking the way that they approach a well-known bottleneck in Ethereum's execution and compute. And I think they certainly work for cases where you don't need global state. So maybe you have like a small game running on the side or something, and that game doesn't need to have access to global state. And maybe the finality requirements aren't as strict. In that case, it works. I think it's a viable approach. What I don't like is not so much L2s as much as kind of the people who promote L2s, who make it seem like L2s are the only way forward and that they will solve any and all problems, and solve world hunger and save, I don't know, the universe from heat death. And so it's just like L2s work in certain cases and they're good for certain cases. But L1s in general are going to be more flexible. L1s might be worse in some cases, but that is to say, they both have their uses, and to loudly proclaim that L2s are the only way to do something is unfair to everybody else that's working on the L1s. And one of the examples I use for this is, and I don't like doing this too much, but Brian from Coinbase, Brian Armstrong, I saw him in a podcast with the All In folks, and he was saying things like, L1s in their current state are like so expensive and slow, and you need to pay $10 and wait like minutes for it to finalize, because he's trying to push like Coinbase's L2 base. And it's like, okay, you don't have to say that to promote an L2, right? You can acknowledge that there are scalable L1s that work and are fast and are efficient without making it seem like L2s are the only savior. That's kind of the thing I don't like about L2s. And yeah, I think that's and but then some of the L2s kind of get into this weird territory where they're like, okay, what if you added now L3s for certain cases? And then at that point, I'm just like, okay, maybe that approach isn't the best one if you need to keep stacking L's on top of it to get somewhere. And also, I don't like this other approach where people are like, well, there's going to be an L2 for every website and there's going to be thousands of L2s. It's like, no, there's just absolutely no chance that's going to happen. Like there's zero chance that's going to happen. And not only is it because of fragmentation, but Ethereum literally could not handle that in any case. So I like L2s. I don't like when L2s are marketed as the savior of crypto.
I think you hit on a couple of the reasons why it's important that Monad is actually in L1. And I would love to hear kind of you expand more on your thoughts about Monad's decision to launch as an L1 rather than an L2, given that the goal here really is to scale and support more robust apps.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's actually a very simple decision, right? If you start from first principles and it's like, okay, why are we in this crypto thing? It's like, okay, we want to build decentralized applications that solve problems for users. And can you do that right now in L2s? It's like, well, kind of. I mean, they are still quite permissioned and centralized and not very scalable. Now they will get there, especially with Dank sharding going live in like 3 to 5 years. They will get there, but that's a very long time to wait. And if I want to build the best possible products, I'm going to build them on a scalable L1 that's still decentralized, but it also scales. And so with that in mind, maybe I don't want to use something like Solana. Maybe I just don't like, I don't know, its values, or I don't like Rust. And maybe I just want to be like, okay, well, I like the EVM, but I don't want to build on an L2. Then I think Monad's kind of the perfect answer. And, Monad could also add L2s at any point in the future and be able to add them much easier. Or you can maybe even fork Monad and create your own app chain, right? It's open source software at the end of the day. And so I think if you look at it from first principles, I think starting the L1 is the kind of a no-brainer idea, technically speaking, and speaking from a product sense. The one thing that I would say that could be an interesting thing going forward is, there'll be certain developers who will be like, wait, well, if I really want to build on like a very scalable L1, why wouldn't I use like a Sui or Solana? Why would I go on again on the EVM? And that could be an interesting discussion. But at the end of the day, I think Monad has things, like I said, like deferred execution. I think Monad DB as well, parallelization as well, and kind of there's also, blockchains aren't just technical things. There's the social and economic layers to it as well. And I think there's a very, very big opportunity for Monad to kind of show the Ethereum community like, hey guys, L1s are still kind of the most important part of this. And hopefully maybe Ethereum can take some things away from Monad as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you were saying there about attracting developers, because my perspective, at least within this niche of crypto, is that it's always touted an EVM chain makes it easy to attract the developers because there's so many that are familiar with Solidity, already building on Ethereum or similar EVM chains. Do you see current developers in crypto flocking more to the EVM, and new developers that will enter or are entering now may go with something like the SVM or Move? Or what's your overall thesis around that?
From what I've seen, and obviously I have a lot of confirmation bias and some sort of a tunnel vision, let's say, because of my position, I would say that there are more people coming into SVM than I've seen before. And there was a point where a lot of them were actually going to move, and things like Sui and Aptos. I don't see that as much anymore. But I do see them still coming to SVM and EVM. Just very good mindshare, good SEO, good standing with developers, and it's also just simpler to write. If I'm being honest, it's just going to be easier to write a Solidity contract than a Solana program at first, especially for most people's skill sets, right? Monad is, Solidity is kind of like a JavaScript, whereas Solana programming is like Rust plus functional programming. It's not very easy. And it's going to fall on the teams building on top of those networks, in my view. to actually attract those developers, right? So like Ethereum had like Infura, Solana has Helius, and then maybe Monad will have one of these other teams as well. Maybe a Monad native team. That'd be pretty awesome. But as far as my thesis, I think there's kind of two segments. One is people who are like super crypto native who are already in the space, and those I think will always be dispersed between SVM, Move, and EVM, and maybe mostly EVM. But then there's people in Web2 who just want to build products and want to build businesses and things that scale and build the future of the internet. And then they will do what's best for the job, in my view. And if they need like a globally shared kind of composable state machine, they'll probably use something like a Monad or Solana. If they don't really care, maybe they have like a small game or something, then they might still use Monad or Solana, but they could also use an L2. And like we're just so early in, I mean, crypto itself isn't early, but I would say smart contract platforms that are scalable are very early. And in that sense, there's still so many things to be figured out that it's hard to make any conclusive predictions. But I would say L1s will be easier for developers to work with and conceptualize.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And in terms of attracting developers to Monad and bringing apps on top of Monad, I think one thing outside of the technical community that's underknown or perhaps even underappreciated is that you can essentially just copy and paste your app from Ethereum or another EVM chain and run it over on Monad. So what effect do you think that will have in terms of the existing community of EVM developers and perhaps bringing some performance advantages to ETH?
Yeah, it's a good question. Generally, what tends to happen with these things is like there'll be like a few people who actually literally copy and paste the code with some switches, and maybe they have a good go-to-market, and then they generate some buzz, and people maybe use it, and they're like, "Oh wow, this is much better than Ethereum, let's say the L1." And I think that's going to be a good momentum boost for Monad. And then it's going to be just about retention, right? How many of those people stay, and is that a repeatable process? And I think if that can be knocked out and executed properly, then I think Ethereum probably, or the Ethereum community probably starts seriously considering like, hey, wait a minute, were we correct on the L2 thing? Do we maybe go back to try and scaling the L1 a little bit more? So I think that could be an interesting dynamic. And I have no doubt that I think it'd be very silly if they didn't at least try to take some things away from Monad. Like extremely silly. Now, making EVM code, backwards compatible and stuff, that's a huge challenge, and there's a lot of specific things that are very hard there. But I think they can be figured out. Certainly Ethereum has overcome much bigger challenges in the past, but who knows? I think, and I keep saying this, but another big part of this will be not the technical stuff, but the economic and the social stuff, which is kind of a weird thing to think about in my view, and because I'm like an infrastructure guy, but it does make a difference. Are you guys able to attract people who are building things of value, a community that has kind of shared values that is not the exact same as X and it's like substantially different, and kind of keeps growing over time and can retain people who come over. A lot of kind of the new L1s kind of have struggled with that, right? I think Solana is really the only one that's succeeded other than Ethereum so far. I'm not mentioning Cosmos because Cosmos is just kind of a bunch of different L1s, but Cosmos also. And so that's going to be like the key part. And a lot of it is going to have to do with timing as well, right? Like exactly when everything goes live and what the state of the market looks like. So there's actually some element of luck here as well, which is I always kind of don't like thinking about, but it is a reality.
Yeah. Obviously, narrative moves so quickly in crypto, and and community is such a very key thing to have that presence, to have that reach, and then to bring on those end users. Without it, it's really tough. And obviously, as we've seen this year in a down market, it is really challenging. But we're coming off really a huge month for Solana, a lot of rekindled energy across crypto Twitter. There's obviously talks of the Bitcoin spot ETF. And in terms of Solana in particular, coming off a really successful Breakpoint conference, I personally have noticed a lot more startups shifting into hiring modes, and I believe Helius is included in that. So kind of given this current energy in the air, what's your take on what the next 1 to 2 years looks like for crypto?
I think a lot of it will have to do with macro in a sense as well, and regulation. And crypto is a global movement, of course, and maybe what's happening in the States is not what's happening in Japan. And so there's a lot of variables there, but in general, I would say in the last few years, or probably a year and a half, there's been kind of a huge over-indexing on AI. And a lot of a good amount of the builders that try to pitch me on their startups were now raising AI companies. And I was like, that's interesting that a 22-year-old has so much domain knowledge in so many industries. But, and I think people have realized that maybe there's been over allocation there. And okay, so where else would they go? Well, now there's crypto, there's AR, VR, those kind of the most attractive spots, I would say. And with blockchains finally scaling, right? Because just even 2.5 years, 3 years ago, one of the biggest criticisms of blockchains were like, okay, well, they're just slow, inefficient databases. And it's like, correct. But now they're much faster and more efficient. And with things like Solana and Mana kind of leading the way, now you can actually build things that are like delightful UX, and actually can solve real problems that people have in the world. Stablecoins are a good example, not the only one. Decentralized physical infrastructure networks like Helium, for example, are great for this. Just a much more efficient form of finance, and you can kind of see this with like Visa expanding to Solana as well, from Ethereum. And so in terms of what the next 2 years looks like, and I'm already seeing this now, there's actually just much more competition than before. You can see people kind of coming back, and everybody's trying to build, and things are heating up a little bit. And so within 2 years, I would imagine there's a lot of developers who are just building and experimenting. And it's very hard to say like, okay, for example, Friendtech is a good example, right? I don't think anybody really saw that coming, but it happened. And I think it's a very interesting experiment, and the team there can execute. And if we can get 3-4 more of those types of applications that are like not black swans, but they kind of change how we think about certain dynamics, I think that's when even more people start coming in, and then they see these apps, which ends up even creating more applications, kind of a flywheel effect. That's kind of how I see it playing out. Now, of course, there's the other side of this, which is like, okay, maybe regulations are like really bad, right? Maybe the US is like, nope, we're just going to kill crypto. In that case, there's probably kind of a retracting period for like a few years while people kind of think about this crypto thing internationally. But I think like in that case, all that happens is you just delay the future of crypto by a few years. It's not trivial, but I think that's also a possibility.
Yeah, I think that's great perspective. It's certainly exciting to see some of these viral and innovative apps like Friendtech popping off, and also getting to a point where, like you said, there really is a delightful UX. If you go on Solana and you transact on chain, it's going to happen really, really fast and really, really cheap. And that right there solves actual problems. But taking it back to our Twitter spaces on Monday, for Monad Mondays with the Swap Finance team, we were discussing a couple areas where DeFi is really limited on a broad macro level. And those were security, performance in terms of inability to host a robust financial system, and still being quite far from traditional efficiency in terms of performance of financial products, as well as that regulation piece as well. So to kind of expand on your previous answer, what does this next step look like for blockchain, or really which areas do we need to solve for most pressing?
Yeah, I think regulation is a big one, but also just real problems that people have is something we ironically don't focus on too much. I think, and part of the reason why is because regulation, but you'll kind of see this, and this happens in bull markets where somebody announces something like, cross-margining interoperable interstellar X layer for X dimensional liquidity or something, and you're just like, what the hell is that? Can we just build something that would help a person actually get use of crypto? And I mean, we haven't really done that. And we just need to do that better. And I think in terms of, okay, most pressing. So yeah, I mean, DeFi still has things to figure out in terms of security and the latency differences are going to be there with a decentralized system. You can make them smaller, I think, over time. They'll just be there, but you must sell kind of a different benefit to the users. And I think really the only thing that took off last time around really was kind of this idea of NFTs and collectibles, and I think basically what sparked the last bull run was maybe NBA Top Shot in a sense, right? People collecting those cards, and I thought that was pretty cool. And I think if we can get, and one of the reasons it was cool is because it did solve somewhat of a real problem, right? Like collectibles, people collect sports cards and stuff all the time, but now they could collect it and kind of it's already part of their persona. Now it's kind of their persona, part of their digital persona as well. And so it's just, in real world assets is another interesting one that's kind of popping up recently, right? There's still a lot of challenges there as well, but I think that's an interesting one. I know some of the financial institutions, have this mandate of, not mandate, but goal of like tokenizing everything such that it's more efficient finance for everybody and more accessible and stuff. That could be interesting. I think one thing that's like a kind of a far-fetched idea because it's a very hard work, but something that's super cool in my view still is DePIN, which is the idea that you can bootstrap these physical infrastructure networks with tokens and have people build companies that they couldn't before. Like Helium is taking on kind of the mobile sector. There's a team called HiMapper who's taking on Google Maps, right? Like that's a pretty serious competition, but they can do that because with tokens and crypto, you are able to offload network effects and kind of output to the token network. And so you can do cool things like that. GPU rendering, right? With the age of AI, especially. That's a cool application of it. And then payments is kind of the OG use case, but it's also a super important one. Like when I can, and I actually do this, but like if I want to send somebody money, that's not from like I don't know, my jurisdiction in Canada, it's just so much easier to just send them the USDC. Like it's so much easier. And so there's a lot of low level things that we need to still work on there, like on and off ramps and KYC, and if everybody needs KYC. But it's okay to put it short. DeFi, payments, DePIN, kind of digital identity, I think are all going to be really interesting ones. But also finance is like and I know like Monad is one of the things Monad wants to do is enable like better order books because it enables better capital efficiency and whatnot. So I think that's a very noble goal, and I'm pretty excited to see where that goes as well.
Yeah, I believe the idea there in short is to be able to have fully on-chain order books on the EVM as well, which would be certainly exciting. And agreed with your other point there. I think it's pretty clear that at least for payments, crypto really has a market fit, and will be really exciting to see the expansion over the next few years, hopefully solving additional problems and some of those other areas that you mentioned. And I think your work and your contributions to crypto are very directly related to that with Helius. So before we wrap up here, I want to make sure to give you a chance to briefly tell us about Helius, anything that you're working on or you want to shout out.
Yeah, so this actually like interestingly ties in well with your last question, which is okay, what does crypto need from here on out? And the reason we started Helius wasn't just to start a company for its own sake, but basically the thesis is that it's just, there's the biggest problem in crypto is that there's a lack of useful applications, I would say. And one of the main reasons for that is that it's historically been too difficult to build applications that are fast, cheap, and scalable. Right? There's always kind of this trade-off when you have high performance. The developer experience is maybe a little worse, right? So JavaScript is very easy to write, not that performant. Assembly, Rust, very hard to write, but much more performant. And so what Helius says is like, okay, you can build fast, cheap applications on these high throughput L1s, but the developer experience isn't as good. And so how do we give people the tools they need to just not worry about any of this stuff and just focus on products? And so that's everything we build towards is for that. And so that's why we exist. We are only on Solana right now. And so I imagine it probably won't be of too much use to this audience. But I think, and I chat with like Kevin and some of the Monai guys anyways about just jamming on high performance RPC stuff. So I think there's always kind of lessons to be taken from Solana and Monad. I think it's just like a very sensible and reasonable kind of collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. Would certainly love to see more collaborative efforts there. I think one thing that Monad and Solana both share uniquely is somewhat of the community energy that's really open to collaboration, open to new ideas, and a lot of new users as well. Myself coming into crypto first really during that first growth cycle for Solana, and certainly hopeful to see great growth for Monad as well. And would love to see Helius potentially partnering up or jamming on some stuff with the Monad folks in the future. That would be very exciting.
Yeah, no, I DM'd James a few months ago on the hardware requirements for running a node. So we'll see. Obviously no promises, but happy to help out if it makes sense to do so.
Yeah, I think those hardware requirements should be pretty similar to what we were talking about previously, being able to run that on a pretty solid gaming setup with a nice internet connection.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, when the network comes out, I'll just run a node myself just to have fun and see what I can do. Anyways, and yeah, I'm just very passionate about pushing the frontier of kind of L1 scaling, and so anything I can do to help out, not even just the Helios side, but on a personal side, just let me know. And I even got some Monad memes made for me, so I'll be using them judiciously going forward.
Awesome. Well, community will definitely be super excited to have that, and certainly appreciative for you joining the podcast today for our first ever episode. I know a lot of folks were really excited, some even setting alarms in the middle of the night for people on the other side of the world to catch this live stream, which we will also publish after the fact as a full podcast episode. But pumped to have had you here, Mert. I think crypto needs more people like yourself, and certainly appreciative of all the support and wishing you great things in the future with Helius, with Lightspeed, with Solana in general. Hope to chat again soon.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It was an honor to be the first guest. And yeah, really excited to see kind of what Monad accomplishes and anything I can do to help. just let me know.
Outstanding. Well, it was great talking to you. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in today. I hope to catch you for our next episode soon. And thanks again, especially to Mert and Monad. We're looking forward to the testnet upcoming, followed by the main net. Stay tuned for announcements on that as well.
All right.